everyone. Welcome to the webinar with Rubicon. My name is Laura Murphy and I'm from Tech Connect and excited to welcome you here and MC our conversation. We're joined by Rubicon Vice President Connor Riffle, who will speak in just a minute. And our topic is 7 ways to get routing right. So very excited to have you here and thanks for taking the time for this 45-minute call. We'll end with questions, so we really encourage you as we go through the webinar, make sure you ask those in the questions panel on the side for the GoToWebinar control panel. So be sure you do that, and if you have any concerns or anything you need along the way, feel free to put those in the chat for me. We'll remain on mute so that everyone can hear. We don't have any background noise and things like that. And we are super excited to get started. So Connor's going to speak on the topic, and then we'll cover as many questions as we can get to. Anything we're not able to get to, we will cover after the fact. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Connor.
Awesome. Thanks, Laura. And great to be with all of you. Thanks for joining us. I'm Connor Riffle, SVP of Smart Cities at Rubicon. And today we're going to be talking about routing. So we got a lot to cover. It's a big topic, and we're going to try to get through the high points, or what we call 7 ways to get routing right. So come along. It's going to be a fun journey. Laura, if you could give me the first slide, that would be great. So just a quick overview of Rubicon. We are a technology company. We've been around since 2008. Our focus is really in the waste and recycling space, as well as the kind of generic or general public works space. We have 2 sides of our business. One side of our business, we manage the waste and recycling portfolios for lots and lots of big companies. The other side of our business is our fleet SaaS business, where we make technology to empower heavy-duty fleets to run their operations more effectively, more efficiently, and more sustainably. Routing is a big part of that, and that's why we're gonna do a deep dive on that today. Next slide. We have quite a reach all across North America and indeed around the world. We actually manage ourselves about 13 million individual service locations for things like waste and recycling. We've deployed now our technology with municipalities in over 100 cities all across North America, and we focus on not just waste and recycling, but also looking at things like snow removal and street sweeping operations. Next slide. So routing is a very large topic. It's a complex topic, and there's a couple of different types of routing. So the first type is the type that most folks are going to be familiar with, and that is what we call the traveling salesman problem. This is routing that you're familiar with. For example, the kind you might get from Google Maps or Apple Maps. This type of routing provides a navigable journey from point A to point B with maybe a stop or 2 in between. And in math, as I mentioned, we call it the traveling salesman problem. And common routing software can handle a few dozen or so stops at a time for this type of problem. And so for most folks, you've encountered Apple Maps, you've encountered Google Maps, you might think, oh, well, routing, it's not that big of a deal. You know, I can use my smartphone to just tell me where to go, how to get from point A to point B. And this is true for kind of common everyday cases. So for example, if you're running an errand to an unfamiliar store, or you're going to find a new friend's house, this type of routing is sufficient. But for many of the applications in a municipality, in a city, this type of routing, what we call point-to-point routing, is actually insufficient. And the reason is that most folks need to route more than, say, 2 or 3 stops at one time. They might need to route a very large number of stops at one time. So for example, if you do residential waste collection in your city, every single route that you have will be about 1,200 stops. If you do street sweeping in your city, you'll be sweeping about 2,000 individual street segments for a given route. So these numbers are very, very different and the scale of routing is very different in these types of scenarios. So we call that high density routing. And mathematically, when the number of stops goes up so high, the math behind it gets much harder, and it gets different. So mathematically, we have two types of problems: the traveling salesman problem, and then what we call the 7 Königsberg bridges problem. So the 7 Königsberg bridges problem is the mathematical underpinning behind the kind of math that we need to do for routing a stop of, say, 1,200 stops, or a stop of, say, 2,000 street segments. So Königsberg is where this problem was originally elucidated, and it was actually worked on by a mathematician named Leonard Euler, who basically turned 2 islands and the mainland into nodes, and the bridges connecting them into edges. And for it to be possible to cross each bridge only once, the number of edges leading into each node must be an even number. So this problem is incredibly complex, routing in a city. And in many situations, when you have 1,200 or 2,000 individual stops that you need to go to, there are billions of potential travel paths that you could take to get through that high density route. So what does that problem look like? Not in medieval Königsberg, but in modern day America. Laura, if you could give us the next slide, please. It looks like this. Now, this is the city of Surprise, Arizona, but I think it could describe many of your cities. Does anybody have any idea how to route a truck efficiently through this number of homes? You need software to solve this problem. Well, first you need our friend Leonard Euler to come up with the algorithm and the math behind this. And then on top of that, you need software to help you design the most efficient route to get through there, and to compute all the different combinations and tell you which one of those combinations is right. As I mentioned, there are literally billions of potential combinations and potential paths that you could take to get through a route, for example, the city of Surprise, Arizona. But only a few of them are ones that you might want to take and might actually meet your needs. So we need Mr. Euler. We also need good software. But before we get there, we need to look at some of the other challenges that are associated with routing, because it's not just a math problem. Laura, next slide, please. So I laid out the math challenges of high density routing, but in the real world, there's a lot of other challenges when it comes to high density routing. So let's look at a few of them. I've listed a few of them on this slide. And you as a city, you might not have all of these challenges in your city, or for the particular routing use case that you're looking at, but you might have some of them. So these are questions that you should ask yourself before you engage in any routing project. So just to highlight a couple of them. Correct side of street servicing. This is a really important question that we get all the time, which is that often routing programs won't be able to take into account the fact that, for example, a garbage truck or a street sweeper needs to go up one side of the street, and then it needs to cross over and service the other side of the street as well. So that's an important calculation and something for you to keep in mind. If your routing problem involves, for example, garbage or street sweeping or even snow removal, then this is going to be a challenge that you're going to need to face. Single pass versus double pass. Do you need to do one pass on that street to be good? Or in the case of snow removal and in a wide street, do you need to do multiple passes up and down that street so that you can make sure you remove the snow from all of them? These are all important questions to ask yourself. Turn restrictions is another one. If you want your heavy duty vehicles to be doing U-turns in the city, then your route and your travel path are going to be different than if you don't want to have U-turns, your heavy duty vehicles making U-turns. So there's a number of real world challenges that you need to consider, and that make high density routing not just mathematically challenging, but also challenging in a real world context. Now let's talk about why getting these challenges right is important. And it comes down to why getting routing right is so important. Next slide, please. So routing has a large impact on your day-to-day operations. If you're running heavy-duty vehicles, these trucks are very expensive to run. And the cost associated with routing these vehicles can be very significant. So let's just take a garbage example. Each garbage truck costs about $300,000 to purchase, okay? If you're the city of Houston, for example, you own 300 of these vehicles, okay? Each of these vehicles gets around 2 miles per gallon. And you have to staff all of these vehicles with 3 people per truck. And you have to go to around, again in the city of Houston, 400,000 individual homes every week. You have to go to their front door every single week, rain or shine. So if the route that a truck in this city takes takes just 15 minutes less, then the city will save nearly 4,000 hours of truck runtime per year. And that, in a very conservative calculation of runtime costs, about 300,000 annually in vehicle runtime costs. So saving that 15 minutes is less wear and tear, it's less gas, it's less overtime, it's fewer accidents. So routing matters. So let's talk about, next slide, how to get routing right. And what we've done is we've come up with 7 recommendations, 7 ideas for you to think about as you're thinking about how to make sure you get your routing project right. Next slide, please. So let's dive in. So good routing starts with good data, okay? I want everybody to remember that. And part 1 is all about your services and your maps. So let's talk about services first. The first thing you need to ask yourself is what we call service fundamentals. What are you servicing? Now, usually in cities, the answer is, well, we're servicing our residents, right? We're picking up garbage at a particular, particular households, or we're servicing, we're sweeping the streets of residential neighborhoods. So that's great, but you need to go a step beyond that, and you need to make sure you have really good data about who your customers are and exactly where they live. You would be shocked, or maybe some of you might not be shocked, if I told you how many cities have trouble answering just this question. Who are you responsible for servicing? And where exactly do they live? And this is totally normal. You shouldn't feel bad if you're answering that question like, yes, I don't know who all of my customers are. It's normal. We are moving generally from an era of doing this type of operation in paper maps, and we're moving to an era of doing everything digitally. And as part of that transition, we need to get better data about who our customers are and where they lived. We shouldn't do any routing project until we can answer the question about who your customers are and who you're servicing with 100% certainty or very close to. We hear a lot of, oh, we have 80% of our customers, we have 90% of our customers. Again, that's fine, but your routing project is going to be more successful if you can start with that 100% number. And then put a pin in this, because we're going to come back and talk about this particular thing a little bit later. But this is a good place to start. Who are your customers? Now, if you're servicing street segments and you're just worried about servicing street segments, it's the same question. What streets are you servicing? Which streets are you responsible for servicing, and which streets are you not responsible for servicing? Make sure you know this, and if you need to, validate your data that you might have in a GIS database or something else. Validate that data with local knowledge, so that you can make sure you have a really good on-the-ground understanding of which street segments that you're responsible for servicing. All right, next step is knowing what your vehicle fleet looks like. Do you have the right vehicle fleet? What is this? What are the tonnages of your vehicle? What type of vehicles are they? How many rear loads in the case of garbage do you have? What is the size of the hopper in a street sweeper? All of this is important, because if you get the tonnage wrong on your vehicle, then they're going to have to go, for example, to the disposal site more often. And if they have to go to the disposal site more often, that's going to completely change the travel path and the route and how much your vehicles can accomplish on a daily basis. So make sure you have a really, really good understanding of your vehicles and all of the necessary details about those vehicles. Now, there's a bunch of other data points to take into account. Do you have statutes about service frequency? This is very common in street sweeping. We have to sweep our streets at least once per year, once per quarter. Every locality is different, but you need to know that so you can build that into the routing. Do some of the landmarks require higher priority? That's also important. So if you have hospitals, schools, city hall, the mayor's house, whatever it is that you need to service first, you need to make sure that's included and you have that information up front. Your routing project is going to be much better if you can do that. And then let's talk briefly about mapping. Mapping is really critical, and making sure you have the right base map is really essential. So lots of cities are maintaining their own base maps, their own layers about different features and layers in the city. That's great. Make sure your street layer is navigable. Make sure that the data that you have and that you can put into your software has the right information in it, has the right street segments, it has the right segmentation. Make sure that it's navigable. Make sure you have all the necessary information. And if you don't, ask for help, because again, this is normal, right? It's normal that maybe you don't have perfect information. So this information gathering part of starting a routing project is really critical. And by the way, all of this is relevant not just for high density routing, but if you do point to point, if you do routing where maybe you have 15 stops a day that you need to send your pothole repair crew to, or your bulky waste pickup crew to. All of the things that I'm saying here are also directly relevant for them. You don't want to be doing a routing project where you're having to change the underlying base maps or the underlying street segments or any of that once you start. You want to get all that right to begin. All right, next slide. Now, remember when I said a good routing project starts with good data? Well, it continues with good data too. That's why we have a part 2. So welcome to Get Your Data Right part 2. The next level of data is a little bit deeper, but it's still critically important if you want to get your routes right, okay? So for example, let's look at one of my favorite topics, which is, Connor, I know which customers I service. I have 100% accuracy on what my customers are and what their location is. Great, I will say that's fantastic. But what we're actually looking for is not the parcel information, so not the center point of the parcel of that person's location. We're actually looking for the collection point, for example, for a street sweeper service or for for garbage pickup. So in the case of garbage pickup, I don't just want to know where the parcel is, I want to know exactly where the bin is. And this is very important because if I route everything to go up and down the front and pick up on the curb for every single one of your residents, if any of those residents set their trash out at the back of their home, for example, in an alleyway, then that's going to mess up all the routing and we're going to have to redo that. So we want to make sure that we have not just kind of your high level data right, but that you actually can drill down and give us the individual points that you want us to route those trucks to. And that is going to save a huge amount of time down the road and make your routing project much more successful. There's other detailed data points that are important, and I mentioned a couple of them here. Service time, how many seconds per household is it taking you to service garbage collection? For street sweeping, how many seconds does it take you to get down a street segment? These assumptions are really critical. And again, it's going to vary from city to city. So the more data you have about that kind of deeper level, the better the routing is going to turn out. Wait time is especially interesting when we're talking about, for example, wait time at a landfill to dump either a street sweeper or to dump a garbage truck. Sometimes in some cities, if the landfill is managed by a third party, the trucks might be waiting out there for 45 minutes. Well, that's got to be incorporated into the routing. If the truck is going to be standing out there for 45 minutes, we got to make sure that the route is less aggressive because you're going to lose 45 minutes at the landfill. If the landfill is particularly far away, that's another issue that you need to take into account. So marshaling all this data is critical, and that's why it gets 2 of our 7 ways to get routing right. Next slide, please. Okay, so good routing project, once you have all your data in place, and once you give us kind of all this basic stuff, then the next thing is to run what we call scenario analysis. And this is where having good software really comes in handy, because what you're going to do is you're going to think about all the different possible ways that you might operation. Remember at the top, I talked about how there's billions of different ways to route a garbage truck through, for example, the city of Surprise, Arizona. Well, that is the case. And so what we want to do is try to break that down, not into a final decision, but into a series of scenarios. And what you're going to do is look at those different scenarios, and you're going to see, you know what, this scenario optimizes for like the minimizing the wait time at a landfill. This scenario optimizes for my drivers being in the truck the maximum amount of time. This scenario optimizes to reduce overtime. And you're going to be able to compare all of those different options, and you're going to be able to choose the one that's right for you. So this step is very important as you're thinking about how do you narrow it down from billions of options to 2 or 3 options that humans can actually wrap their head around. We can even actually, show your folks a few of these different options, and you can get input from other people in the city. So you can figure out what are the priorities for you, and kind of what is the set of routes and the distribution of those routes that makes the most sense in your city. There's probably, in my experience, going to be a lot of folks that might want to weigh in on that. So you want to make sure you get that input early. And another really good thing to take into account here is distributing the workload across days and weeks equally. This is a very important issue for your employees. Often they want to make sure that the loads are balanced, and that one team doesn't have a particularly light day, another team has a heavy day. So those are things to take into account when you're looking at those different scenarios. Next slide, please. So once we've looked at those different scenarios, then what we can do is we can actually create a set of draft routes. We can select one of those scenarios, and we can create a set of draft routes. Okay, given the different scenarios that we talked about, you're choosing this one, which takes into account the things that are important for your city. Great. Now we're going to create a set of draft routes based on that input. And having this draft route allows you to look at the different routes, and then to think about, hey, do I need to make tweaks to this route? Let's make the cutoff of this route this road as opposed to making it this road, because it's a different neighborhood, or there's some kind of local knowledge that would drive you to make that change. You can do all that with these draft routes. So we go through, we create the scenarios, and then we produce these draft routes, and this will allow you to understand and start to conceptualize, okay, how am I going to break my routes down? How am I going to look at what makes the most sense for my city? Next slide, please. And then this is a really important part of any routing project, is once you have your draft routes, test them in the field. Look at them on paper, but don't just assume that because they look on paper, they're going to make sense in the real world. Engage your staff in actually testing those routes. Have them run a few of those routes, have them tell you what they think. Have them flag up areas where they feel like it doesn't make sense to do it this way, or have them drive the outlines of the route so they can say, like, yeah, this makes sense based on my 30 years of experience in a street sweeper or in a garbage truck or in a snowplow. I know that this is a reasonable amount of territory to cover. So that's a really important component of this. Now, another important component of this is when we have the routes, we also want to create a travel path through those routes, okay? So the route will tell you how many stops and which stops are on a particular route. The travel path is going to tell you what is the exact path that I take to get through and to service all of those individual stops. And this is really important because there's lots of different ways, even once you create a route, to get through that route. So this is where feedback from your team is really important. And you have 2 options. You can either set the travel paths for your team and tell them, hey, this is the most optimal way for you to drive this particular route. And that will take into account efficiency, minimizing deadheading, all the things we take into account with our software. But on top of that, the alternative option is that you can actually let the drivers dictate their travel paths. So if you have an employee base that is very sophisticated, they have deep experience, they know the city really well, then one option you could do is say to them, here's the broad outlines of the route, you figure out the travel path, and then we can capture that information and we can create the travel paths based on the way that your drivers are running it. So all of those are options, but don't skip this step. Testing the draft routes in the field is critically important for making sure you get buy-in from your entire operation. Next slide. Once you've decided that you've got the routes, you've got the travel path, you've gotten feedback from your team, when you're ready to roll the routes out, you can roll them out with turn-by-turn directions. Now, what this will do is, however you've designed the travel path, whether you let your team do it or whether you've dictated what the travel path will be, you want your drivers to follow that new travel path. And importantly, you want the travel path to be set so that if you have to have a substitute driver or you have somebody else come in and fill in, they know exactly the right way to run that route. This is going to be the way that you minimize misses or skipping segments or leaving sections unplowed. This is going to minimize all of that. So turn-by-turn directions is really important, and make sure your drivers, when they're doing that, they have access to those turn-by-turn directions for rolling that out. Now, you may, once you have drivers and they know the routes, they're probably not going to want to use the turn-by-turn directions anymore, and that's fine. But you have them, they're available, and if you have substitute drivers, you can get them to use. You can give them the tablet with the turn-by-turn directions, and that's going to make things easier. Next slide. All right, and then updating frequently is really important. Okay, so what we see is a lot of cities that do an optimization, create new routes, do a big routing project, and then leave it. And that's fine, but I would say best practice and what we recommend is to update those routes over time. Okay, cities are growing, right? We still have a huge amount of urbanization in the US. We have fast growing cities. We've had population shifts, for example, as a result of the pandemic, and cities are changing. So keeping those routes up to date is important, and it will mean that your next routing project will go a lot more smoothly. This goes back to the data problem that I talked about at the beginning. Now that we're making this transition from paper to digital, and we're going to have actual machine readable data for all this information, the key thing is to keep that data up to date with new homes that come online, new neighborhoods that need to be serviced, new street segments that need to be serviced. Make sure you capture that data, make sure it's up to date. You can, using our software and using other tools, you can actually resequence, like basically re-optimize certain routes to take into account new homes or new subdivision or things like that. So this kind of pruning and help and updating is very, very helpful, so that the next time you go to do this, you're not, you don't have to spend 6 months doing data collection or data updates. So next slide, please. All right, we've talked about a lot. I hope this is useful. We obviously our company provides lots and lots of software tools that can be helpful. And in fact, I'm going to be joined here shortly by Paul Patterson, who is our VP of software development, who came from FleetRoute, who was actually the founder of FleetRoute, which is one of the most powerful high density routing tools on the planet. And Paul has been working in this space forever and knows a lot, has seen every type of routing project all over the world. And we're so delighted to have Paul and his expertise in-house and in creating the process and the path that we talked about on this call to help you all do the best possible routing projects that we can deliver. So I think we're going to move to questions now, and I'm really delighted to be able to have the chance to talk with all of you and share some of our wisdom on 7 ways to get routing right. So thank you, and we'll open it up for questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Connor. That was great. If you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the questions tab, and we will get to those shortly. I had a couple of questions for you as we allow people time to sort of get their thoughts organized. What happens if a driver's going along a route and there's a temporary block? What happens with rerouting in the moment? How do we handle that?
Sure. So there's a couple of different ways to handle that. Depending on how temporary is temporary, right? you know, one of the things the drivers can do is log that issue and then send that back to dispatch. And then what we can do is actually basically create a new route that goes around that particular obstruction. So that's one option. If it truly is temporary, let's say it's blocked for construction for one day, right? Then what we can do is that our technology is flexible enough to allow the driver to veer from that route, and then our technology will actually provide the turn-by-turn directions to get them back onto the correct route after they've gone around that particular obstruction. So I think building in that resiliency is really important, right, in the technology, because we're going to encounter these obstructions, right? It's going to happen. Cities are changing every day. Despite all the efforts that we make to coordinate across different departments and make sure that the garbage team knows when the pothole team is going to be paving a certain section of the street, we don't always connect and we don't always make that happen. So the key is to build in flexibility so that if the driver does have to skip a street, they can log that, they can tell us why they had to skip that street, and then they can get back to the path as soon as they're physically able to do, and they can continue on with our route.
Okay, great. I have a question from Zachary. Does putting services on hold affect route optimization?
Good question. It can, right? So for example, if you have a large number of services that you want to put on hold, or a large number of, for example, let's take a case where you might have a large number of residents that leave for the winter. What you can do is put those folks on hold, and then you can actually resequence the route. So what that does is allow you to create kind of a new route that doesn't include those folks, right? Those inactive customers. And you can actually do some of this on the fly in our software. So in the case of, for example, snowbirds or people that are gone for the winter, if it's significant enough, then you can actually reroute and create a new sequence that doesn't include those routes. If it's just temporary, then, you know, for example, it's a day or maybe a week that they're on hold, then maybe it doesn't make sense to do an entire resequencing of the route, and maybe you just want to skip them for a week, and just mark that they're inactive. So different ways to handle different scenarios, but it's a really good question. And again, it goes back to this question of flexibility and resiliency, right? Which is that no matter what we design in the software, there's always going to be something on the ground that's going to change things. So we got to make sure that resiliency and that flexibility is built in. Paul, did I cover it all?
Yard waste routes are also quite seasonal, so you may have a set of yard waste routes for fall, spring, winter, and so forth, and save the resources over seasons. So in the winter, the yard waste is not needed very much. Those resources can be deployed to snow plowing, for instance.
It's funny that you mentioned that, Paul, because James asked a question about seasonality. What happens, how do you handle that in general? Like his example was more leaves in the fall fill the sweepers faster. So how would that impact the routing aspect?
Sure. Well, Paul, go ahead and then I'll fill in.
Yeah, you would have different sets of routes for the different seasons that you want to deploy. So you would optimize, and given the amount of detritus or leaves that are presented at different seasons, then your volumes go up. They have to tip more often. You need more vehicles, or you need to run the vehicles longer. So you have more routes effectively in those seasons, and then you can reduce those in the off seasons and have your resources, your people freed for other activities.
Okay, great. And it's funny because you just keep anticipating the next question.
We've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, you mentioned resources. So one of the questions we have also is, does adding jobs affect the optimization then? So how would you address increasing the number of jobs in a location and that skew of the numbers?
When we optimize, we're reducing resources, but the idea is to redeploy those people into increasing recycling services, make improvements, better customer service, So the idea generally is try to reduce the costs involved, the number of vehicles and so forth, and redeploy those people in other more productive areas.
Okay, great. Thank you. As a follow-up to a prior question from Zachary, who said it's more related to recycling services provided to residents and putting their service on hold due to contaminated containers. So like rather than on hold the whole fleet, thinking about an individual location being put on hold and the ability to monitor that within the system.
Sure. No, it's a good question, and this is coming up more and more as contamination becomes, it continues to be an issue in waste and recycling. A lot of cities are putting in place punitive measures to make sure that that they don't end up with a contaminated stream. So I think the answer is it depends on the scale. So if you've got, I don't know, on a let's call a recycling route 2,000 customers. If you've got 350 of those that you've put on hold because of contamination, then that's a significant enough chunk that you may want to consider doing a resequencing, especially if it's going to be for a significant amount of time. If you've got 50 and you're hoping that in 6 weeks you'll be able to give their can back and they'll be able to continue recycling, then it maybe doesn't make sense to do that, and you should just put them on hold in the system. And what will happen is the drivers won't, in our particular system, the drivers it won't tell them to pick up that particular house. So that's kind of the way I would handle it in that particular situation. But again, I think like this again gets back to the flexibility and the resilience and the ability to change these routes over time, and in response to kind of the reality of how things go on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have questions, don't forget to get them in. We only have a few more minutes, but our next one is, how long does route optimization take approximately from start to finish? So how much data is needed as well to do the route optimization?
Sure. So it depends on the scale. If you have, if you're only trying to optimize a single route, or you're trying to optimize for example, a daily route that's 20, 40, 50 stops, some of that can be done actually like on the fly automatically in our portal or in kind of similar technology. If you're talking about a complete, like for example, rebalancing of the routes across an entire city. So like, let's say we're optimizing, 50 different routes across the city. Then, usually that project takes about 6 months from start to finish. And we're taking into account a lot of the things that I mentioned in this presentation, which is a lot of the data that I talked about up front, a lot of the kind of the important factors that the city wants to build in, like we call these constraints. So a great example is, in garbage service, do you want to do 4-day-a-week service, 4 10-hour days, or do you want to do 5 8-hour days, right? That's a very common thing in garbage. And another common question is, do you want to, when we're rebalancing and we're redoing all these routes, do you want, are you okay with everybody's collection day changing? So these are constraints that we take into account, and when doing that, along with all the data about the vehicles and all the other things that I mentioned in this presentation. So all of that is factored in, and that usually takes about 6 months from kind of beginning until we actually can deploy these new routes.
That would be then for
broadly on average. Go ahead, Paul. Yeah.
That would be for the beginning initial routing, and then once that data is in place and you keep it up to date, then it's much easier, much quicker to reroute. So that's the advantage of keeping at it day to day, updating the customers that come on and those that come off. You can then restart, reroute, look at various scenarios as time goes on, much quicker, much more efficiently. So the biggest amount of time is getting that initial data set up correct, the steps 1 and 2 in Connor's presentation.
A quick follow-up on that one. Is it during that 6 months, is it better not to alter any of the routes then?
Yeah, I mean, I think the routes that you're running during those 6 months are the routes that you're doing now, basically. So I think, you're gonna if you have to flex those routes or you have to change things, like I think that's okay, right? It doesn't necessarily affect the process that we're running. Once we're complete and once you're happy with the routes and once you're ready to roll them out, then at that point you do a cutover, right? And you say like, okay, as of this Monday, we are no longer running the old routes, we are running the new routes. And once you've done that cutover, at that point, that's when you should be rolling out the new routes. And again, it's not that you shouldn't be making changes, but you should be making kind of small tweaks. But you shouldn't be thinking about doing a complete a reroute again, at least not for a while.
Okay. All right, I hate to end the party, everyone, but we are at time. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure getting to talk about this and dive in on some of the details. Take your 7 tips for success here, and hopefully those in attendance can run with them. If you do have any further questions, please feel free to reach out to Connor and Paul. We had their contact information up on the screen. And you can also reach me. I'm Laura at techconnect.org, and I'm happy to redirect you to Rubicon if you have any follow-up you'd like to do with them. So thanks to everyone and have a great afternoon.